الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وسيدنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. A couple things I want to talk about before I get into the topic. First and foremost, ISNJ, I believe that's what the masjid is called, yeah? Okay, I'm not really familiar with the particular masjid or organization. However, I am familiar with the concept of a masjid in general. And I just wanted to say that one of the best investments that you could possibly make in this life is an investment that pays off in the akhirah. And a masjid is that exact type of investment. And that story that he was talking about, Brother Saad, the story he was talking about, he mentioned, I don't know if people fully grasped the gravity of what he was saying, that in many countries, subhanAllah, that when a call like that goes up, when someone says, here's a masjid being built, because you have to realize in a lot of those countries, it's the government that pays for the masjid. Saudi Arabia, for example, people don't have an opportunity to build a masjid. And so when and if a call like that goes up, there's a waiting list of people, because people are so desperate to be able to give just something towards a masjid. Why? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man bana lillahi masjida, bana Allahu lahu baytan fil jannah." That a person who builds a masjid for the sake of Allah, that Allah will build for them a house in paradise. And this, subhanAllah, the issue of building a masjid, this is becoming more and more obsolete. And I have no doubt, subhanAllah, and I think I see this coming, that there will come a day where there will be no more calls for masjids to be made. Why? Because as masjids get made, and at some point it is going to get institutionalized, inshallah ta'ala. But right now we are put in this position where, subhanAllah, we can donate towards a masjid and give towards a masjid. And this is a type of investment, subhanAllah, that keeps on paying off. That as you live your life, and even after you die, subhanAllah, you may find that you show up on the Day of Judgment, and all of those deeds that you didn't really see, like you didn't see what happened with the masjid, all the goodness that came from it, that is a place where, subhanAllah, you saw all this reward show up on your scale of good deeds. So I just wanted to reiterate that point, not only, and this masjid especially because this is local to you, but anytime you get an opportunity either to invest in individuals, students of knowledge, or you get an opportunity to invest in a thing like a masjid, something which is an ongoing charity, that this is inshallah ta'ala something which is extremely, extremely beneficial. Secondly, I know the organization Why Islam was mentioned. I just want to clarify, I don't work for them, I work with them. And the reason why I clarify that is because a lot of times people hear about Why Islam and they hear that it's an organization, they do this and that, and they say, okay, it's just them doing their stuff. Right? And I guess I can attend their talks, but I can't, like, they're just their own organization. And the reality is that we can all work with organizations like Why Islam. You don't have to be like on their payroll. You don't have to be like an official. You don't have to have like a business card for Why Islam. I don't have a Why Islam business card. I work with them. When they need my help, I try to help them out as much as I can. And that is basically what they're asking from you as well. And the whole idea is that it's about da'wah. It's about teaching people Islam and showing people what Islam really is. Unfortunately, we live in a society where there are so many negative voices that are speaking for Islam, or so many voices that are biased against Islam that get the limelight, and they're the ones that get the microphone, they're the ones that are put on the news and all that. We need to support organizations like Why Islam, and even organizations like NJ Da'wah, people that are involved in doing da'wah. And even this conference, subhanAllah, for me, the reason why I was here last year, and the reason why I was actually happy to come this year as well, is because this is one of the conferences where I know it's not a huge conference. I'm not to put the conference down at all. I know it's not a huge conference, but I see that, alhamdulillah, there's quality and learning that happens at this conference. And it's not just a conference that is just about feeling good, which I think is fine. It's cool. It's okay to come to a conference and feel good, have your iman go up. That's nice, alhamdulillah. But it's not just about that. It's about building a community, and I think communities very much need to be supported. We unfortunately do have a call these days that is calling people away from the masjid. Almost like we need to separate ourselves from the masjids and find our own places to develop our spirituality and our Islam. And subhanAllah, the masjid is a very big part of our Islam. And if you see, subhanAllah, the message of the Prophet ﷺ, it started from a masjid, it started from the haram in Mecca and then the haram in Medina, and that was the growth of Islam, and that was where the tarbiyah was given to the Sahaba. So honestly, these masjids and these organizations do need to be supported. That being said, I apologize for this long intro, and I know I've taken my own time, so it's khair, inshallah. Before I begin, inshallah, can I just get a quick show of hands? How many people attended part 1 of this session? Part 1. Okay, so a few of you, inshallah. Okay, so basically we're going to be continuing on, but in this session of this workshop, I'm going to be speaking about some of the principles that we must keep in mind and the principles that we must adhere to when giving da'wah. And for those of you who weren't there during my first session, I talked about how we're not just talking about da'wah to non-Muslims, and that's what people think when they hear the term da'wah, that we're talking about non-Muslims. We're not talking about just non-Muslims. We're talking about guiding anyone to goodness, bringing anyone to khair and goodness and to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It can be non-Muslims, it can be Muslims, it can be your parents, it can be your children, it can be your friends, it can be your colleagues, whoever. It can even be your peers, subhanAllah. We are all, subhanAllah, involved in da'wah, knowingly or unknowingly, subhanAllah, as Muslims living in America, and this is something I mentioned in the first session as well. But I know most of us would not think of ourselves as da'is or du'at. And we would say, we only think of du'at as someone who is on stage giving da'wah, or someone who's standing on the street with leaflets and flyers, and maybe those are the only du'at. But in reality, the fact that we are Muslims living in America, we are Muslim Americans, we are all giving da'wah, either willingly or unwillingly. We are doing that by our actions, by our behavior, how we treat people, how we act around non-Muslims and even Muslims. We are involved in da'wah. So it is essential, subhanAllah, that we understand when giving da'wah, when we are living our lives as Muslims, some principles that need to be kept in mind. And I have for you eight principles today. There are more than this, and there's obviously a lot more that needs to be learned and taught regarding da'wah and how to give da'wah and things to keep in mind. But I just have 8, inshallah ta'ala, 8 principles for you. So those of you taking notes, make sure you get all 8 points, inshallah ta'ala. Number 1, da'wah has to be given for the right reasons. Da'wah has to be given for the right reasons. What we are speaking about here is the issue of sincerity, is the issue of why do you give da'wah in the first place. And that has to be that da'wah is given for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we know, da'wah is something that can be an act of worship as long as we have the correct intentions. And with all acts of worship, the same rule applies. Without sincerity, this is an action that not only will it not be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can actually be punished for that action. So if our sincerity is missing, and obviously we know from the hadith of Umar radiallahu ta'ala an, which most of you, hopefully all of you know, it's also the first hadith in Arba'in Nawawiyah, where the Prophet said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that actions are judged by their intentions. Meaning, when we show up on the Day of Judgment, we may think that we have done so much good, but if our intention was not pure, if our intention was not that we were doing it sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that is something that could even be held against us on the Day of Judgment. There is a narration that I mentioned in the previous session. That was a narration of the young Jewish boy who the Prophet ﷺ gave to him. This is mentioned in the Sunan of Imam Abi Dawud, in which it mentions that there was a young Jewish boy, basically, he was Jewish, he was not Muslim, and the Prophet ﷺ heard that he had gotten ill. And when the news came to the Prophet ﷺ ran to his house. And it's interesting, subhanAllah, the narrators, they mentioned that the Sahaba, they were walking behind the Prophet ﷺ, because when they would notice that something was urgent to the Prophet ﷺ or important to the Prophet ﷺ, it was immediately important to the companions as well. So they followed the Prophet ﷺ to see where he's going. And they would say that it was hard for us to even keep up with the Prophet ﷺ. He was walking that fast. He was in that state of urgency. Anyhow, he went to the house of this young Jewish boy. He gave him da'wah on his deathbed. He called him to La ilaha illallah. And on his deathbed, this young boy accepted Islam. And what's interesting, I didn't mention this in the first part of this talk, but what is interesting is what the Prophet ﷺ said after this young Jewish boy accepted Islam. The Prophet ﷺ said, Alhamdulillahi alladhi anqadahu bi minan nar. The Prophet ﷺ said, all praises to Allah, Alhamdulillah, for the one who has saved him from the hellfire through me. And what we learn from this hadith, what we learn from this narration, is that the Prophet ﷺ is seeking reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his guidance of this child. And he said, I am just a means by which this child was guided to Islam. And so we see here that here the Prophet ﷺ is reminding us of the issue of having sincerity or doing our da'wah for the right reasons. And this is the beauty of having sincere actions, is that our sincerity, our intention, can change regular actions into acts of worship. So subhanAllah, imagine that you live your life every day, you do what you do, and you pretty much do exactly what you have been doing your whole life. Or let's say you wake up in the morning, brush your teeth, get ready, go to work, you work, and then you come home and whatever, that's your day. Imagine now that you make the intention that the way you behave while you're at work, the actions that you take, your character with your co-workers, this is your da'wah. And you're doing this sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now what you have done here is that you've transformed your regular interaction between you and your co-workers into an act of worship that you can be rewarded for by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the da'wah that I'm talking about. Like I said, we need to get out of the mindset where we think da'wah is only for very specific people or for a certain class of people in Islam. That is not the case. We all need to be du'at, we all need to be forces for good, calling people to goodness. Now, a question that often does not get addressed when people speak about the issue of sincerity is, how do you become sincere? And actually, this is one of the doors through which actually shaitan attacks people as well. Sometimes shaitan will come to an individual, and I saw this happen to quite a few students of knowledge, where shaitan will convince them that they're just never sincere. And I remember, subhanAllah, when I first started my studies at the University of Medina, one of the first hadith you study at the University of Medina in the Arabic program is the hadith of the first 3 people to enter the hellfire. And this basically, to summarize or to quote this, to give you the meaning of this hadith, the first 3 people, one was a hafiz of the Quran, somebody who learned the Quran and taught the Quran to people, and also a student of knowledge, one who learned Islam and taught Islam to people. The second one was somebody who gave charity, and the third one is the one who struggled in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, fighting for the sake of the Muslims. And these are the first three people to enter the hellfire. And we find out in this hadith why. It is because they weren't sincere. And we know in this hadith that they're questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah asked them why they did these actions, and the people will claim that they did it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the person is told, kadhabt. You only did it so people, for example, would say you're so knowledgeable in this and that. Or for the person who gave charity, you only did it so people would say, look how charitable you are, look how generous you are. Or the person who fought in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they say, look how brave you are, fighting and defending the Muslims, and so on and so forth. However, and because of that, subhanAllah, they are led to the hellfire. And we know that these are amongst the first people to be taken to the hellfire. Now, if you haven't heard this hadith before, can I get a quick show of hands if you haven't heard this hadith before? If you have not. Okay. I always like to see how people react when they first hear this hadith because of my reaction. My reaction when I first heard this hadith was I was scared. Why was I scared? I'll give you my mindset. I had traveled all the way from America. I had never lived in the Middle East before, at least not for that extended amount of time. I was in a foreign land, a place that I had never been to before. And I show up, and it's been now a couple months that I've started studying Arabic and Islam, and I'm in a place, subhanAllah, where I want to struggle, and I want to make some sacrifices for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I want to put in all this hard work. And I look at myself, I say, this is my first year, and let's say your studies take 6 years. I say to myself, I have 5.5 years to go. And 5.5 years ahead of me, I see this hadith, I hear this hadith, and I say to myself, how do I know that the next 5.5 years of my life I'm only aiding myself in going to the hellfire? Because how do I know if I'm really sincere? And wallahi, at that moment, I was incredibly scared, to the point where I almost said, you know what, forget it. I don't want to do this. I don't want to put myself in a position where I can be led off to the hellfire because I'm gaining this knowledge, but maybe I'm not sincere. Because I said to myself, how do I really know if I'm sincere or not? Maybe one day I'm giving da'wah, I'm on stage, I'm speaking in New Jersey, 2014, NJ da'wah, and all of a sudden, shaitan whispers to me and I become insincere. Khalas, everything that I've done so far has now led me to the hellfire. And that led me, subhanAllah, to become very scared until I went and spoke to somebody who I consider to be a mentor of mine, somebody who I looked up to. And I said to them, listen, I'm thinking about packing my bags and going home because I don't really know if I'm really sincere. Like, how can I tell if I'm truly sincere? And he replied to me, and what he said to me, subhanAllah, is Incredibly valuable advice that till this day I not only remind myself, but remind my brothers and sisters about this as well. He said to me, he says, as long as you are worried and concerned about your sincerity, inshallah, you are on the correct path. But the moment you stop being concerned, that is when you are truly in trouble. Like, why would you stop being concerned? For one of two reasons. Either you stop being concerned because you feel secure, and you say, you know what? My sincerity is perfect. I'm just like the most sincere, humble, amazing person in the world. I never have to worry about my sincerity. And so that is when you need to be scared. That is when you need to be concerned. Or if you let shaitan get to you and you begin to believe that you will never be sincere, so what's the point? Let me give up the action. Right? And that's basically where I was. And so in those cases, that's when you need to be concerned. However, as long as you're concerned about your sincerity, and concerned not meaning just worried and don't do anything about it, concerned meaning you constantly struggle with your sincerity. And being sincere is a daily battle. It's a battle from moment to moment. You may find yourself more sincere in one moment, and in the next moment you are less sincere. And so we know, even this is one of the ways that shaitan attacks us, the attacks of shaitan are relentless. Likewise, our battle against a shaitan has to be relentless as well. We have to continue to struggle against a shaitan regarding these matters. So point being that this is a continuous struggle that every da'i has to go through, and I would say every Muslim has to go through as well, that when we're making da'wah, when we're calling towards goodness, that we are constantly checking our sincerity, and if we find any lapse in our sincerity, that we bring ourselves back to the correct path. Number two, second issue that we need to keep in mind is understanding the da'i and understanding the mad'u. Understanding the one who is giving da'wah and the one who is receiving the da'wah. Okay, the one who is giving da'wah is inshallah ta'ala us, the da'i or the da'iyah. What do you need to understand about yourself? You need to understand, number one, where you stand when it comes to your knowledge. So you don't want to give da'wah beyond your knowledge. You don't want to speak about Islam without knowledge. And this is another principle that we're going to come to a little bit later on as well. Secondly, your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A da'i must be, just like they are working to call people to Islam, likewise they must be working on themselves as well when it comes to their spirituality and their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This includes what we mentioned in the first principle, and that is the principle of sincerity. Also, it includes our worship. And I often tell brothers and sisters who are involved in Islamic work, whether it be you volunteering for an Islamic organization, whether it be even if you're, subhanAllah, just someone who is checking the tickets at the door, I still consider you to be a volunteer working for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether you're a volunteer for this organization or that organization, whatever, if you're actively involved in some Islamic work, you have to hold yourself up to a higher standard. Meaning you are not like the ordinary person when it comes to your acts of worship. Meaning you have to be striving extra hard in your ibadah. And especially someone who is in a position of gaining knowledge or using that knowledge to teach other people or to guide other people to the goodness. And so, this is something, subhanAllah, one of my teachers, he told me, he said, if your knowledge is above average, then your worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be above average as well. You shouldn't be content with a low amount of ibadah. So you should say to yourself, what is the difference between me, a da'i, or as a volunteer, or someone who is doing goodness, and this person who basically comes to the masjid once a week for Jum'ah, and they pray their 5 daily prayers and that. What is the difference between us? I have to hold myself up to a higher standard. And subhanAllah, interestingly enough, if you look at the da'wah of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ, in his first 13 years of da'wah, there were no issues that had become wajib. There was no fiqh issues that had become wajib upon the Muslims. So the salah had not become wajib. The zakah had not become wajib. The siyam had not become wajib. However, were there people at that time, were there companions who would pray? Yes or no? Yes or no? The companions who accepted Islam in Mecca, before the salah became wajib, before it became fard, were there people praying? Yes. Were there people fasting? Were there people giving charity? Yes. Were there people making tawaf? Yes, there were. That was all extra deeds. However, they did that because that helped them raise their iman. And the Prophet ﷺ was giving them that tarbiyah to be ready to teach other people Islam as well. So likewise, as I said, getting to know yourself and getting to understand yourself and where you stand with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, the da'i must be introspective regarding their own character, something that we discussed in part 1 of this workshop. And that is, a person needs to work on their character, they need to work on their characteristics. Even, for example, a da'i must understand where they lie when it comes to how quickly they get angry, or how they deal with jealousy, or how they deal with arrogance. These diseases of the heart and these issues, a person, before they go out and give da'wah, they need to understand themselves. If you're somebody who gets irritated very quickly, if you're somebody who gets annoyed very quickly, if you get angered very quickly, maybe it's not a good idea for you to be standing at the head of the da'wah table telling people, I'm here talking about Islam. Because wallahi, when you make da'wah, you're going to come across people who are infuriating. They will annoy you. It'll be irritating, some of the things that they will say. Obviously, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a belief that somebody who is Muslim and they understand Tawheed, it's a nonsensical thing. It doesn't make sense to worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, there are people who lead their whole lives in that way, and it requires an immense amount of patience on the part of the da'i to be able to be patient with the people and explain it once and twice and over again, and still the person may say, I don't believe. I remember, subhanAllah, when giving da'wah when I was in college, I would often stand at the da'wah table, and that was a big learning experience for me, subhanAllah, when I would work at the da'wah table, stand at the da'wah table, because I learned so much about how to interact with people when giving da'wah. I remember, subhanAllah, one day I was speaking to a Christian, and I explained the concept of Tawheed to him. And we went through the Trinity. We talked about the Trinity. And I said, here are like 10 ways or something in which the Trinity doesn't make sense. And after an hour-long conversation, subhanAllah, telling him the, Tawheed and how it agrees with your fitrah and how it makes sense and all this kind of stuff, and going through the concept of the Trinity and how Christianity was actually distorted and this and that, and this was not the message of Isa alayhi salam, and whatever. At the end of this conversation, subhanAllah, this guy was like quiet. He was listening to me. And I was feeling good about myself. I'm like, I'm getting through to this person. At the end of talking to this guy, subhanAllah, an hour, I think it was an hour and a half, and I remember, subhanAllah, I skipped my class because of that. Right? I was getting late for class, but I was like, no, the da'wah is more important than my class. Right? And I stood there and I gave him da'wah. I talked and talked. And then at the end of it, he says, listen, Jesus actually talks to me. I'm like, what? He goes, Jesus has told me right now that everything that you have said is false. So he told me, he said, I have stopped listening to you 30 minutes ago. And I was like, what? I have been talking, and Jesus now came to him in his mind, subhanAllah, which was probably shaitan, right? He came to him and told him that this man is a liar, don't listen to anything he has to say. And wallah, he took an immense amount of patience to be like, okay, alhamdulillah, at least I got the chance to talk to you about Islam, and to go back and return to the conversation. But if you don't work on your own character and your own patience and knowing how to deal with people, you may end up causing more harm than good. Also, when giving da'wah, you need to understand yourself in terms of your culture and the biases that you may have. Realistically, as much as we claim not to be biased, we all have our own biases. We come from a certain culture. We come from a certain background. We have been brought up in a certain way. And I'm not saying one particular, whatever background you're from, that plays a role in who you are and how you speak to people, and certain things that you hold to be true, and certain things that you believe are to be correct. And I know, subhanAllah, even I can speak to you from my personal experience. I myself, throughout my studies in Medina, I saw myself evolve and change. The person that I was when I started my studies in Medina and the person that I was when I graduated were two very different people. Yes, some of our core beliefs, Aqidah and Islam, is all there. But a lot of my views, I remember, subhanAllah, entering the University of Medina and holding certain beliefs that I thought were like the biggest issues in the world. I remember, and I'll give you one example. Hopefully this won't end up on YouTube, right? But one of the examples I remember, subhanAllah, for me, one of the biggest issues in the world was the beard, right? The length of the beard. And I remember, subhanAllah, before I went to the University of Medina, I would speak to people, and I would very forcefully, I would convey to them that it is haram to trim your beard at all. I would say the Prophet ﷺ said, leave your beards, let your beards grow and trim your mustaches. And this is something I remember, subhanAllah, getting into a very heated discussion with a brother about this issue. And this discussion ended with us just like not talking to each other. Because I was so mad, I was like, how dare you disobey the commandment of the Prophet ﷺ? The Prophet ﷺ said, let your beard grow. And I remember, subhanAllah, as during my studies in Medina, and for those of you who don't know, I specialized in fiqh. That was my major. In fiqh, you cover these issues. And one of the things I learned when studying fiqh, and one of the beautiful things about studying at the University of Medina is we study comparative fiqh. And you begin to learn the opinions of all the madhahib and so on and so forth and compare them. And subhanAllah, I remember the first time I heard someone say to me that the opinion of the majority of the scholars, and the four madhahib are in agreement regarding this point, is that it is permissible to trim your beard. However, they disagree upon how much you're allowed to trim. Some of the madhahibs, they say 1 fist and 2 fists and so on. However, there is an agreement amongst the madhahib, amongst the four madhabs, that it is permissible to trim your beard. And like at that point, like my mind was like blown. I was like, what just happened, right? I was like, what is going on here? This thing that I hold to be abs. And I remember, subhanAllah, I thought back to how many times I spoke to someone and the person had bigger issues, but I went to the issue of the beard. Why was my approach like that? Because I didn't understand that this is my lack of knowledge, my bias that I had going into this conversation. And if you don't understand yourself, if you don't understand your level of your knowledge, if you don't understand your biases, if you don't understand your limits when it comes to knowledge, you can end up doing a lot more harm than good. And so that is yourself. First and foremost, understanding the da'iyah, understanding the da'i. Secondly, is understanding the mad'u, understanding the person that you are giving da'wah to. Just like you yourself, you have your biases, you have your background, you have the way you grew up and all of that. Likewise, the person you're giving da'wah to, you need to understand where they're coming from. And understanding the mad'u, understanding the person giving da'wah to, happens in two ways. Number one is a general way. Number two is a specific way. Once again, understanding the person you're giving da'wah to happens on two levels. Number one is a general level. Number two is a specific level. The general level of understanding the one you're giving da'wah to is understanding the society and the culture of the people in which you are giving da'wah and the person that you're giving da'wah to. Which culture does he or she belong to? Which society does he or she belong to? And understanding that culture and being familiar with that culture and knowing what in that culture agrees with Islam and what in that culture disagrees with Islam. Sometimes people have the belief that all types of culture is bad. And oftentimes you hear, subhanAllah, sometimes when people first start practicing Islam, oftentimes they come up with this idea that all culture is bad. Why do they hold this belief? Because they may see some issues in their culture that go against Islam. And when they see those issues that go against Islam, they look at that and say, all culture is bad. I remember, subhanAllah, for those of you who don't know, I'm Pakistani, but both my parents are Pakistani. There are many things in the Pakistani culture that go completely against Islam. And there was a time in my life where I used to think all Pakistani culture is bad, until I learned and studied Islam. And I learned that when it comes to our relationship with a culture, it falls into, once again, into different categories. There is part of a culture that it is not permissible for us to take that. It is not permissible for us to imitate that part of their culture. What part of that culture is that? The part of their culture that has beliefs and ideas that go against Islam. The part of the culture that has practices that goes against Islam. So if your culture holds a belief that goes against Islam, you're not allowed to partake or imitate that culture. For example, recently, I think about a month ago, I was in Ireland. And there are quite a few things about the Irish culture which are very cool. I like them. One of the things that I don't like about the Irish culture is the fact that they basically, I believe their national symbol is like a four-leaf clover. You guys know about this? Yeah? And they believe basically it brings luck or whatever, and they often talk about the luck of the Irish and things like that. So that is an aspect of the Irish culture that Irish Muslims are not allowed to take from. That they're not allowed to partake in that type. Also, if there are practices in the culture that go against a specific prohibition in Islam, then that is you're not allowed to partake in the culture. However, there are types of the culture, there are aspects of the culture that if they don't go against Islam, some scholars say that there are moments where it is permissible for you to partake in it, and sometimes it is actually mustahab. It is recommended. It is good. It is sunnah to partake in that culture. What is that? Those are the types of aspects of their culture that don't go against Islam, And if you were to partake in those types of actions or issues of their culture, you would be able to be more effective as a da'i. At this part, it becomes sunnah, becomes mustahab for you to take part in that type of actions from their culture. What is an example of this? An example of this is what you would wear, for example. If you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, when Islam came to the Prophet ﷺ, this is something I touched upon in the first part of this talk as well, but when the message of Islam came, the Prophet ﷺ didn't immediately divorce himself from the Arab culture. He didn't say, okay, now that I'm Muslim, I cannot wear Arab clothes, and I cannot eat Arab food, and I'm not an Arab anymore. The Prophet ﷺ didn't say that. The Prophet ﷺ recognized that this is his culture, and this is who he is, and if there were parts of his culture that went against Islam, he took them out. He said, I'm not going to follow that. However, if there were parts of his culture that agreed with Islam, that didn't have any opposition with Islam, he accepted them. The clothes that the Prophet ﷺ wore, they were part of the Arab culture. Regarding our clothes, Islam gives us parameters. Islam gives us do's and don'ts. Islam gives us certain prohibitions and recommendations and so on and so forth. As long as those parameters are met, Islam doesn't dictate for you what exactly you have to wear. For example, if you look at the colors or specific colors and things like that, depending on your culture, one color may be better, another color may not be better, depending on the culture. And one of the examples I gave in the previous section as well is that, let's say somehow, in an imaginary world, you were able to get access to a time machine. You sat in the time machine, and you set it back to the time of the Battle of Badr. And you showed up on the day of the Battle of the Badr, and you got out of your time machine, the DeLorean, I believe, right? Get out of your DeLorean. You walk out of it, and you show up, and it's the Battle of Badr. You look out, and you see two armies standing face to face. It would take you a couple moments for you to actually figure out which one of these parties is the Muslims. Why? Because they look very similar. It's only until you realize that there's a lot more people here, and you know from history that the mushrikun were a lot more. They're almost 3 times the size of the Muslims, and you begin to see certain actions that they're doing. Then you will realize, okay, these are the Muslims. But from the way they are dressed, it would be very difficult for you to tell the difference. And this is why Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah ta'ala, he was of the opinion that the sunnah dress is to wear the dress of the people that you are living amongst. The sunnah dress is to wear the dress of the people that you're living amongst. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ wore the dress of the people that he's living amongst. Right? So this is very, very important for a da'i to understand the culture of the people that he is living amongst, and even adopting certain aspects of that culture to give da'wah. And I say adopting, and I use that word very loosely because obviously there are Muslims who don't have any other culture. I know the immigrant Muslims, we often think of ourselves as adopting the American culture. There are Muslims who are converted to Islam or reverted to Islam, and their only culture is, for example, American culture. So it's not an issue of adopting a culture, it's an issue of keeping the culture that they already had. An example of that would be the issue of changing your name, for example. Islamically, there's nothing that requires us to have a Muslim-sounding name or an Arab name. That's not a requirement in Islam. The only thing Islam tells us is that if your name has a bad meaning or a meaning that goes against Islam, then you should change your name. However, there's nothing that says you cannot name yourself, or that if you're named with a non-Muslim, and I use that loosely, non-Muslim name, that is something which is impermissible for you, unless it has bad meaning. But obviously, if you want to name your child with a name of a Sahabi and whatever, that's good, that's fine, right? Maybe you want your son to be like the Sahabi, that's great. But that is an aspect of the culture that does not go against Islam, so there's nothing for you don't have to change that aspect of that culture. So understanding the culture of the people that you are giving da'wah amongst, understanding even what biases that they may have, understanding their background. This is the general aspect of understanding the person that you're giving da'wah to. The specific aspect of this, we said it's 2 categories, general and specific. The specific aspect of this is understanding the specific person. They may belong to a certain culture, but they may have specific issues, they may have specific things that they've been through, they have specific backgrounds, they have specific life experiences. So your da'wah will differ depending on the person that you're speaking to. We cannot give blanket da'wah. It doesn't work. If you're talking to someone, for example, who has been brought up in a privileged household, they have been brought up with a wealthy lifestyle, they're well educated, and this and that, the da'wah that you give to them is not going to be exactly the same as a da'wah that you gave for someone who has been brought up in an impoverished household, someone who's brought up poor, and someone who has struggled in their life. SubhanAllah, I remember one time I was giving da'wah to a person. This was in DC. One of the things that we would do is we would, this is back in the day, we would make meals for the homeless, and we would give them meals, and we would give da'wah to them. And one of the homeless people, SubhanAllah, he said something to me that like really shook me. He said to me, I don't have time to care about God. Why? Because I don't have food to eat. I don't have a place to sleep at night. He goes, my main concern right now is, am I going to live past the night, because there's no shelter for me to sleep. And it gets cold. It gets cold in DC, and there's no shelter. So giving da'wah to him is different than somebody who's chilling in his living room, in a nice, comfortable, with the fireplace on, they have everything in life. There are going to be two different approaches that you use with this person that you are giving da'wah to. So those are general and specific. Like, principle number 3, or issue number 3, is starting with the most important matters. Starting with that which is the most important. And obviously, when giving da'wah to someone, the most important thing is the tawheed, is starting with the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And like I said, when I'm speaking today, I'm not only speaking about non-Muslims, I'm speaking about Muslims and non-Muslims. Sometimes we may see a person commit a particular sin, and we may focus on that sin. And I've seen this happen a lot when Muslims give da'wah to one another. And I've seen it happen even when parents, when it comes to dealing with their children. You find a parent, for example, they find that their child doesn't pray. And so now they hound their child. Why don't you pray? Why don't you pray? Fear Allah. Pray, 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 pray. And this child may be like 16, 17, 18 years old, and they may even pray just to get their mom or their dad off of their case. But as soon as the parent is not there, what are they going to do? Are they going to pray? No. What is the issue here? And by the way, mind you, salah is one of the most important things in our life. As a Muslim, the salah, as we know, is the first thing you're going to be questioned about on the Day of Judgment. But even the salah, there is something that comes before that, and that is a person's tawheed, their connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If their iman is not there, then how are they going to pray? Why would they pray? Sometimes, subhanAllah, I remember counseling a young guy who was going through issues in his life or whatever. And his parents talked to me as well, and they said, our son is so sinful, he does drugs, and he commits zina, and he parties, and this and that. Can you please talk to him? Can you fix him? That's what I usually get. Can you please fix my child, right? Do something to make him a good Muslim. And I remember, like, in most cases, like, I often tell parents, like, I can't fix your child. Like, I don't have a magic pill, excuse the expression. I don't have a magic pill to, like, give to your child, and all of a sudden, khalas, he's, like, super Muslim, right? I wish there was a pill like that. I'd be like, one for you, one for me. Let's be super Muslims together. There's no such thing. Right? You have to understand the person that you're giving da'wah to. And you have to know what the issue is that they're dealing with. And when talking to this child, not really a child, he was like a teenager, I realized that he doesn't even believe in God. He's been dealing with doubts, and he's like delving into like atheism and things like this. So, of course, he's not going to care about committing sins. Whether they be major sins or minor sins, he doesn't care. Because he doesn't even believe that he will be held accountable for his deeds. He doesn't believe that there's a day of judgment. He doesn't believe that there's an akhirah. Why would he care about drinking or committing zina or doing whatever, being involved in major sins? Why would that be such a big deal? Starting with the most important things. And by the way, when shaitan attacks us, and this is something, inshallah, out of those of you taking my seminar this coming weekend, this is one of the things we discussed as well. The way shaitan works is like this as well. He starts with the most important things. If he can get a person to fall into major shirk or kufr, he won't necessarily worry about the lesser sins. Yeah, he does work on the lesser sins as well, but he will move to that first and foremost, because he knows if he can get the person to major shirk or major kufr, at that point their deeds become null and void. So his job is like pretty much done. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. Allah will not forgive that you commit shirk with Allah, that you worship other than Allah, but He will forgive anything less than that for whoever He wills. So when we are giving da'wah to people, it's important to understand where they lie in these issues. And even, subhanAllah, once again, going back to the da'wah table in college, I remember there was a brother, he was at the da'wah table, he was giving da'wah, and he spoke to this girl, came up to the da'wah table, and she had these misconceptions about Islam, and she said, you oppress your women, and this and that, all this kind of stuff. And this brother, Jazakallah khair, he stood there for a long time, and the only issue they were discussing was the issue of the hijab. She was saying it's oppression to women to make them wear hijab. And he was saying, no, actually, we don't force women to wear hijab, number one. Number two, it's actually not oppression, it's liberation, all this good stuff. That's great. He talked to her for a long time, and in the end of it, she was like kind of convinced, but kind of not. She's like, yeah, I guess I see your perspective. I guess I see how the hijab may be a positive thing. And then, subhanAllah, khalas, they finished talking and she left and he left too. And I remember, subhanAllah, sitting with him later and talking to him. And I told him, can you imagine, subhanAllah, if this girl that you talked to, this whole time, you've been talking to her for like 2 hours or whatever, giving her da'wah. Imagine she dies la qadarallah, she dies in a car accident on the way home. She dies now believing hijab may be a good thing. On the other hand, picture that you had given her da'wah to tawheed, that she believed that Allah alone should be worshipped. She took her shahada believing that maybe the hijab is not, believing that hijab is maybe not such a good thing. Right? Not really understanding the wisdom behind hijab. But now at least she has a chance to enter paradise. What good does it help, what does it benefit her now that she died believing that hijab is a good thing? Will that benefit her in the akhirah any? Does that benefit her? Somebody dies believing that you're supposed to pray 5 times a day. They believe they die believing that you're supposed to give zakah. They die believing a man is supposed to have a beard, a woman is supposed to wear hijab. And they die with all these beliefs, but they die without submitting to Allah, without the shahada. Does that benefit them in the akhirah? No. It does not benefit them in the akhirah. So for a da'i, it's very important to understand to start with the most important issues. I'll share one more personal story with you. I'm sorry, we're going to go a little bit over. I'm just letting you know right now. But I'll share one more personal story with you, inshallah ta'ala. I remember when I was in college, and for those of you who know my story, I didn't start practicing Islam until about halfway through, midway through college. Actually, it was the end of my sophomore year in college. And I actually, for those of you who know, I don't even consider myself to be Muslim until that point because my Islam was basically just like a very cultural type of Islam. I remember when I was in college, I remember some brothers, when they were giving me da'wah. I remember that the MSA, one of the brothers from the MSA, he approached me. He realized that I'm Muslim, even though I didn't really look very Muslim, but he realized that I'm Muslim. He said, how about you come to the MSA? And I said, I don't really know. I'm not really into this like religious type of stuff or whatever. And he said, okay, don't come to like any of our lectures. We're having a barbecue this Friday after Jum'ah. He said, you can come pray Jum'ah with us and you can attend the barbecue. It's like brothers will be there, we're going to play football and whatever, like it'll be great. And I said, okay, what's the harm? I'll go check it out, see what they have to offer, see what's going on. And by the way, mind you, I didn't have any Muslim friends before that. I grew up without Muslim friends. And so this is the first time now I'm actually going to hang out with like Muslim guys. And so I prayed Jum'ah, alhamdulillah, the khutbah was, alhamdulillah, mashi al-hal, it was okay. And then I go to the barbecue, and I remember, subhanAllah, that day I happened to be wearing a t-shirt, and this t-shirt had a picture of a man by the name of Jim Morrison. Does anyone here know who Jim Morrison is, by any chance? One person in the back? 2 people? Okay. A few people here. Jim Morrison is the lead singer of a band called The Doors. And this is one of the bands that I like. This is an older band. I don't want to get into the history of the band and music and all that. He was a lead singer of a band called The Doors. He has a famous picture where he's standing like this, shirtless. He's wearing pants, but he's not wearing a shirt. And basically, I was wearing a t-shirt that had a picture of Jim Morrison on it. And I didn't think much of it. My regular wardrobe was that I would wear t-shirts, and oftentimes they were band t-shirts. I was like really into music. And so I went to the barbecue. I didn't think much of it. I go to the barbecue, and I remember the first thing that someone came up to me, subhanAllah, I remember before, and this is something that I remember till today. Before the brother gave me salam, he's like, hey, what's up with your t-shirt? I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, man, he tells me, did you pray Jum'ah like that? And I was like, yeah. He goes, okay, all right. And then another brother comes up to me, and I remember, subhanAllah, almost every single person that came to talk to me that day, they started with my t-shirt. Like that was the biggest sin in the world. And I remember, subhanAllah, that day, I stayed there for maybe about 15 or 20 minutes. Then I'm like, listen, man, this is just annoying being around these people. And I was like, I don't want to have anything to do with Muslims. I don't want to have anything to do with the MSA. I can't deal with this right now. And what was happening here, subhanAllah, is that people were focusing on something. Yeah, it's not good to wear the Doors t-shirt, right? It's not good to have a t-shirt with a guy whose torso is naked, fine. But there were bigger issues that I was going through. I didn't even really consider myself to be Muslim at that point. But people didn't focus on that. They focused on something like my t-shirt. And this is from the lack of knowledge, a lack of principles for the da'i. And like I said, you may think I'm only talking about du'at here. I'm talking about the average Muslim here. Now this is an issue that we all need to be careful about. SubhanAllah, whether we are actively making da'wah or not. When we deal with other people, we see a sinful Muslim, we see a sinful person. It's very important that we start with the most important things before we go to lesser issues. And even if you look at the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, it is exactly this. Once again, for 13 years, the first 13 years of the da'wah of the Prophet ﷺ, none of the commandments had come down regarding fiqh and regarding the obligations of prayer. None of that had come down. It was in Medina when the iman had become strong and had become firm that the commandments came down. We know the narration of Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha when she mentions the issue of khamr, of alcohol and intoxicants. That the Arab at that time, alcohol was a big part of their society. You know, we tend to think of our society like alcohol is really prevalent. I would say even more so at the time of Jahiliyyah, that alcohol was a big part of that society. Imagine now that Obama stands up, gets on TV, and he says, today I'm enacting prohibition. How many people would go along with that prohibition? How many Americans do you think would be like, okay, since Obama has said it's not okay, it's illegal to stop drinking, we're going to stop drinking? As a matter of fact, we have a case study, because in the 30s, prohibition was enacted. And what happened? Epic failure, right? Epic failure. Everybody wanted to drink, and it led to crime and mafias and mobs and a whole nother rack of issues that came from that. However, you look at the Sahaba, and you look at when the commandment came to them, and like I said, alcohol was more prevalent in their society than it is in ours. When the commandment came for alcohol to be haram, the Sahaba quit it immediately. There are narrations mentioning that they poured the alcohol in the streets. They spat it out of their mouths. And some ulama of seerah, they mentioned, subhanAllah, that some Sahaba, they made themselves throw up even though that wasn't required of them because they were so disgusted by it. Why were they disgusted by it? When there's an activity that just one moment ago they're involved in that activity. Now they're disgusted by it. They're disgusted by it because their iman is so firm and their iman is so strong that when they know it's a commandment from Allah, their heart and their soul rejects it and says, I may be enjoying this thing, but I know that if my Lord has commanded me against it, if my Lord has prohibited, it must be something which is bad. How many of us look at the prohibitions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we say to ourselves, I may not get the hikmah or the reasoning behind this prohibition, but I know that my Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knows what is best for me. And He is the one who has prohibited this action, so I will leave it. You know when that happens? When your iman becomes firm. When you have become grounded in your faith. And this is why, like I said, for a da'i, it's very, very important for them to understand that until and unless you create fertile ground, then the plants will not grow. The plants of the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not flourish. It's not going to happen. And this happens on all levels, whether you're dealing with Muslims, non-Muslims, you're dealing with children, adults, whoever. It's very important that the iman strengthens before we move on to the lesser of issues. And I know I'm out of time, and I've only reached point number 3. I'm going to quickly run through the 7 other principles, inshallah ta'ala. Okay, principle number 4. A da'i must call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not call to themselves or not call to a particular group. Meaning, the da'wah has to be about the da'wah itself. It has to be calling to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, it's permissible to work in organizations and groups and things like that. All of that is great and it's fine. Whatever you can do to assist in that da'wah, that's excellent. But in the end of the day, a da'i must be calling to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that supersedes any organization. It supersedes any group or whatever that you belong to. And if you notice, subhanAllah, if you look at the ayat in the Quran, where we see the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ. Say, this is my path. I call to it. I call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon insight. Notice that the ayah says, أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ. I call to Allah. So in the end of the day, the da'i must keep in mind that partisanship is poison to the da'wah. Partisanship can destroy years of da'wah. Once it becomes about an organization, about a particular group, it can destroy the da'wah. And likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He said, وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ قَوْلًا مِمَّنْ دَعَا إِلَى اللَّهِ. What is better in speech than the one who calls to what? To themselves? To their group? To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 5, it is important for the da'i to weigh the harms and benefits in the da'wah that they are giving. And like I said, this is not only da'wah on a lesser scale, da'wah on a bigger scale when it comes to non-Muslims and all that, but even in specific issues that you may be giving da'wah to. Before you give da'wah to something in particular, a particular issue, you call someone away from something, you must weigh the harms and benefits in that issue. We have an example of this in the hadith of Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari, in which she says that she asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about the hijr of the Kaaba. The hijr of the Kaaba is that U-shaped thing which is next to the Kaaba. She said, is that area from the Kaaba to the hijr, is that part of the Kaaba or not? And the Prophet ﷺ said, indeed it is part of the Kaaba. She said, how come then have you not included it into the Kaaba? How come you haven't built the Kaaba back to its original form, meaning that hijr is part of the Kaaba? And she said, most certainly your people are new in Islam. And if I didn't think that their hearts would not accept it, I would have done so. So what's happening here? The Prophet is saying, I would have definitely included the hijr into the Kaaba. I would have restored the Kaaba back to its original structure. And that is what is best. However, in this case, the harms of doing that are worse. There are more than the benefits of including into the hijr. That there would be an uprising, people may get upset, and so on and so forth. So this is why I chose to not include that into the structure of the Kaaba. But however, still tawaf, we make around it. Number 6, it is important that our da'wah is paired with knowledge, and this is something I touched upon, I believe, last night as well, and even earlier. But the importance of knowledge, Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, in his Sahih, he has a whole chapter titled, Al-ilmu qabla al-qawli wal-amal, that knowledge precedes action and speech. And as we said, without knowledge, and we gave an example, I believe, last night as well, but without knowledge, we can end up causing more damage than good. Point number 7 is that a da'i must not rush to find results. That a da'i may be faced with rejection after rejection. In the end of the day, the da'wah is not about numbers. The da'wah is not about how many people accept your message. The da'wah has intrinsic reward in it, meaning we seek reward from the da'wah itself, not particularly from the numbers. And we see the example of the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, who gave da'wah far more than any of us can even imagine. 950 years he gave da'wah to his people. And he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that he said about himself, قَالَ رَبِّ إِنِّي دَعَوْتُ قَوْمِي لَيْلًا وَنَهَارًا. He says, my Lord, I called my people day in and day out. فَلَمْ يَزِدْهُمْ دُعَائِ إِلَّا فِرَارًا. That my da'wah did nothing for them except that they got even further away from me. They were running away from me. And 950 years he made da'wah. We know in the end of the day he had very few followers. Right? His ummah was very small. However, his reward lies in the act of giving the da'wah. So the da'i must be patient when giving their da'wah. Lastly, principle number 8, and I apologize for rushing through these principles, but we have to realize that guidance of the heart lies with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That what we are responsible for is the conveyance or the conveying of the message, and we cannot change people's hearts. وَمَا عَلَى الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغِ. That the only thing that the messenger has been expensed with or has been accountable for is the conveyance of the message. That you convey the messenger, and we are like that as well, because we are following in the footsteps of the Prophet ﷺ, that we cannot change people's hearts. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about the Prophet ﷺ, and this is a message given to the Prophet ﷺ, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ. That you cannot guide the people whom you love. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ. Rather, it is Allah who guides whomever He wills. So yes, we are going to give da'wah and we're going to fail a lot. It's going to happen. The facts and figures, the statistics at the end of the day are not in favor of most people accepting our da'wah. And this is a realization that a da'i has to come across. That there are going to be many, many cases that we're going to fail. And by the way, a sign of a da'i's sincerity is that they persevere even when they don't see the success in numbers, because they have sincerity and they hope for the success in the akhirah. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us sincere in the da'wah that we are giving. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us sincere in all of our acts of worship. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us all with the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ and the ability and the tawfiq to act upon that guidance. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين والله تعالى أعلم وجزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.